All right, guys, going to give you the update for, or the review for tonight, what I did with the kids. We did chapter 7 of the abbreviated, just on Vanity Fair. For that one, if you have the modern revised vision that I have, it would be chapter 7, also entitled Vanity Fair. If you've got the Banner of Truth version, it would be pages 99 to the middle of pages to page 112. And so again, obviously, it's all about Vanity Fair. So it opens up about Vanity Fair. Most of this chapter, most of what I'm going to share with you this evening, I did not talk with the kids about. It was very abbreviated. So um, this is such a topic that it just matters where your kids are. So so I kept it very basic. But Vanity Fair, of course, when you look at what that is, it's this place that's on the path, and so all pilgrims have to go through it. It's very old, all the way back to Adam and Eve, just showing how, just like we saw with Pastor Josh's sermon from Genesis, how the temptations that we encounter are no different than what Eve and Adam encountered in the garden, and it's been the same since. It talks about how it's all year long. And again, the point is, Vanity Fair, which one pastor says it this way: Vanity Fair is the city of destruction in its gala dress, in its most seductive, sensual allurements. And so the point is all Christians have to go through Vanity Fair, where we're tempted with the things of this world, um, to draw us away from God. Some of those things might be evil, some of those things are good. The kids really, especially the younger ones, really kind of struggled with that concept, so that'd be some good follow up. But I mean, they seem to get it by the end, but just the idea that family, husbands, wives, children, good things can become idols in our lives and draw us away from God. That's kind of what Vanity Fair is. And so when Bunyan talks about it, he describes some people that they quote, they never set foot out of the fair. They lived in it all year round. And so again, these are sinners who don't have any desire for Christ. They're Ephesians 2 verse 2. They walk according to the course of this world. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4. The God of this world has blinded their minds, so they love the world and its vanities. They reject Christianity. And that's kind of the whole point of it is it's the things of the world to live for are worthless. Um, Good things, bad things, doesn't matter. If we live for them, they're vain. Christ is the only thing worth living for. That's kind of the whole point. I think one thing that's important to see is, as we're going through this journey, Bunyan kind of shifts at this point, because most of the journey so far is more internal, like how we deal with sin in our souls, how we fight sin, how we do things. And now he's starting to show, kind of, again, it's the allurement of the world. And so it's the external things on the Christian. All Christians are called to be in the world, but not of the world. And so how do we as Christians live in the world but not of it? How do we face these enemies? How do we not be consumed by the allurements of this world, but stay focused on Christ and following Him in the world? And that's kind of the whole point of this chapter. So before I even get going, just think about some of these passages, because they're so applicable if you're reading through the book. 1 John 2, 15 to 16 says, do not love the world. That's kind of what Vanity Fair is. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. We're very familiar with that. But then the next part, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. James 4, verse 4 talks about how uh, uh, friendship with the world is enmity with God. He says, again, James 4, verse 4, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And then lastly is Romans 12, verse 2. It says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And so the point is, I think when you look at all these passages, you see how as Christians we're called to live on a different plane than this world. And we're going to see this in this chapter. We're called to live before the face of God, coram Deo. And to do so means to focus on the things, again, that are not seen instead of the things that are seen. So we need to guard our hearts against the deceitful desires that we have. And so I think a great application for older kids and all of us adults, parents, is to stop and think, and which booth of Vanity Fair, because we're all going through it, which booth draws us the strongest, which booth pulls us. Is it the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the boasting pride of life? And so anyway, so it's a fantastic setup of what Bunyan is doing for us. So Christian and faithful enter into the fair, and they're immediately kind of spectacles. And the reason they're spectacles is because three different things. And I did share this with the kids, and so they should all be able to focus on this or answer this or whatever. But number one, they had different clothes. And so again, remember, they received robes of righteousness. They have the armor of God. So the point is they're dressed different. Again, you got allegory and figurative going on here, but the point is they're different and what they're dressed in and what their focus is on. The next thing is that they're different in speech. And again, I don't think this is, Pastor Josh always says he talks funny. I don't think that's the point, that they're from the Appalachian Mountains, and so they got an accent. What they talk about is different. They don't just use God's name frivolously and in vain, but they use God's name in honor and worship. They've got different focuses on what they talk about, and it shows up as something that sets them apart as distinct. And then the big thing is they don't just buy everything. They have different priorities and values, and this is the biggie. As Christians, our values and priorities ought to be very different than the world's, and this is what Bunyan is communicating through these I think brilliant illustrations. And so they're kind of Christian and faithful, stand out. They're obviously different, and so this leads them to eventually having to endure being scoffed at, laughed at, beat, dirt thrown on them. It's literally, I think in the Bunyan's book, he says, pandemonium breaks out, which is a word from John Milton's Paradise Lost. But the point is it just leads to like total chaos, and the whole fair is just breaking down because of them. And but yet Christian and faithful, through all this and through all that goes on through the whole chapter, they are patient. They don't return evil for evil. They bless those who persecute them. They speak good of those who are are evil against them. They return good for evil. And so the point is you just see how they follow the example of Christ. Stephen, I mean, it's just, this is what Christ calls us to. And so they do, they exemplify this just in a wonderful way. In the Sunday school class with the kids, the teenagers, I've been going through pro-life apologetics, but we've been studying apologetics in general for 2 years, 3 years, and it's so important that when we engage unbelievers, we're gentle and respectful. First Peter 3:15, and this is what we see from Christian and faithful, and so, but the whole crowd, they're riled up, and so they declare them, they bring them before the judge. The judge's name is Lord Hategood, which obviously has issues if you're supposed to be a judge who does what's good and puts down evil, and you hate good. That's not a good thing. And so we see very clearly that the Lord Hategood is like, okay, these guys are guilty. Who can I get to testify against them? And so we see that they're basically declared guilty, and they have to try to prove, faithful has to prove that he's innocent, and rather than being innocent instead of proving guilty. And you really see this issue um, very clearly. Meanwhile, faithful and Christian, as they're being mistreated, they're being wrongly accused, and all these things, they're in prayer. They encourage each other. They comfort each other. They're committing themselves to God's sovereign will, whatever that may be. And it's amazing, and it's funny because in the book it's like, they both kind of want, because they know from Evangelist last time one of them's going to die, and they both kind of want to be the one, because they realize then we get to be in glory with Christ. And but they're committed to following God's sovereign plan. And so the trial begins, and there's three there's three witnesses, and those witnesses then kind of, I think, illustrate that Bunyan thinks that these persecutions kind of arise in the form of these three aspects. And again, very interesting. Um, First one is envy. What is envy? Jealousy. Sees people following Christian and faithful and don't like it. Very similar to the Jews in Acts 13, verses 44 to 45, who they see people following Paul and they get jealous and start contradicting Paul and being hostile to Paul. And so this is one of the forms that persecution arises. And so you read his testimony, and he's seeking to control them. And then the next witness is superstition, also referred to as false religion. And they're upset. He's upset because because faithful said that his religion was worthless. And I think if Bunyan was in our day, he would probably rename Mr. Superstition. He would rename him progressivism. In other words, the superstition that faithful was calling out in Vanity Fair was a religion that didn't believe in hell, believed in lots of ways to heaven, didn't really follow the ways of God. And so he was so offended that he would say, that faithful would say, your Christianity, your religion isn't real. And is that not the day and age we live in, where if you follow very basic Bible truths on creation, that there's one way of salvation, on marriage, on gender, your label is a hateful bigot. And meanwhile, you have Christian, I would say superstition, or progressivism, where they completely reject God's word and minimize things like abortion and have no problem with gay marriage and these sorts of things. You know, is that really Christianity? See, it's not at all. But if you call it out, what are you? And so it's, again, things don't change. I mean, Bunyan is writing this for 300 and some years ago, and maybe it's more, uh, it's growing to be more severe. But the point, the fundamental point I'm trying to make is, at heart, people don't change. These things don't change, and that's what we see. And then the last one that makes a claim against faithful is flattery, and he uh, I told the kids, flattery is basically, making compliments. Compliments are good, but if you make compliments for selfish reasons, you try to put somebody up in order to get something for yourself. That's kind of what flattery is. And flattery is another reason that persecution comes. And remember, I'm not getting into all the background, but like Bunyan had lived all this. He'd been in prison for years and years. So, I mean, he'd been through trials. He'd been through, had judges who were unrighteous. He knew these things at least more intimately than we do, more experientially than we do, at least. And so anyway, so Bunyan does, I think it's masterful, but he has 12 jurors. And just to kind of go quickly, I'm just going to state the 12 jurors' names, what it means, and the statements that they make. They all make one statement. And again, I think it's brilliant. The first one is Mr. Blind Man. So again, think no light. But he says, when it comes to, after hearing all the testimonies and he has to make a decision, he says, I can see clearly that this man is a heretic. Mr. Blind Man can see clearly. The second one is Mr. No Good. So again, the idea, he's got no integrity, no moral integrity. And what's the thing he says? Away with such a fellow. Mr. Malice. What is malice? The desire to injure or hurt others. He says, I hate the very looks of him. That's consistent, isn't it? Mr. Lovelust. So the guy who loves sensuality, fleshly desires. He says, I could never put up with him. Mr. Live Loose. So this guy who's uninhibited, we would probably call him nowadays wild. He says, nor could I. He would always be condemning my way. And Mr. Heady. So what is heady? The idea of being passionate, headstrong, violent. Because I mean, you're not thinking things through. That's Mr. Heady. What does he say? Hang him, hang him. I mean, Mr. High Mind. Again, high mind, pride, arrogance. He says, my heart arises against him. Or, I'm sorry, I misquoted. Mr. High Mind says, a sorry low life. So again, he's looking down on him. Mr. Enmity, the next one. Enmity, what's that? Ill will, hatred. He says, my heart arises against him. So he's got that enmity. Mr. Liar, again, lying, untruthfulness. He just says what? He's a scoundrel, okay? A rapscallion. He says the 10th one is Mr. Cruelty. Mr. Cruelty. So cruelty is the idea of having delight in the pain of others, or at least indifferent to the pain of others. So he says hanging is too good for him. Like, he should suffer more than that. I don't really have any empathy. Mr. Hate Light. So hate light. So what does he do? He loves the darkness. He says, let's get rid of him. And then Mr. Implacable. In other words, implacable, the idea is what he can't be pleased. He's irreconcilable. He says what? Let us immediately pronounce him guilty of death. And so the point is they kill faithful. And so here, faithful, and I'll just read kind of what, at least in the modern version, how that's recorded. It says, Faithful was immediately condemned and returned to his cell, where he was to await the cruelest death that could be invented. Then they brought him out to execute him according to their law. First they whipped him, then they severely beat him, then they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him, then stabbed him with their swords. And last of all, they burned him to ashes at the stake. This is how Faithful died. And so the beauty, I mean, as sad as this is, the beauty of this is what happens is while the world, Vanity Fair, they're kind of gawking at how sad that this is the end of this person, whatever. Bunyan makes sure to record that there's a chariot that takes Faithful up into the clouds with the trump to the celestial city. And so again, we see the difference between the world and what we see and reality, the eternal perspective. And so in that sense, Faithful is far better off than Christian, or for sure anybody in Vanity Fair. And so I share a little bit with the kids about martyrdom, the idea of dying for our faith, and how many people have followed Christ's example of Stephen, and then even people to this day, and that's what we see with Faithful, is an example of that. And I think the big things to see is Christian then is imprisoned, he's chained, but then it says the one who rules over all enabled him to be able to escape, and he moved on. And so we see that in God's sovereignty, sometimes Christians are called to die to demonstrate to the world that Christ is more worthy than even life itself. That to give up our lives for Him is worth it. But then others, like Christian, is called to continue on in this world, and to continue to suffer, and to continue to be a testimony, to continue to encourage people. And so again, we basically have Paul's Philippians 1. For me to die is gain, but to stay on is better for you. And that's what we see in Faithful and Christian. And it's a phenomenal example. I think one of the main things I tried to emphasize with the kids is that this world hated Christ, and we should expect that it will hate us as well. John 15. 1 John 3:13 says, "Do not marvel, brethren, if the world hates you." And I think these are important words. I mean, I hope things change for our kids, but I suspect if you see where things are going, you see that if you hold to basic Christian truths, you're going to be seen as a bigot and hateful in our day. Unless something happens, it's going to be far worse for our children. And so for them to understand that to be hated by the world, but to seek to please God, that's what we're called to do as Christians. And what an example of that in our chapter tonight. So hopefully this is encouragement to you guys, and appreciate you all.